President Lee Jae Myung's Latin American diplomacy takes him to Chile for a summit with his counterpart Jose Antonio Cast, during which they agreed to resume a joint committee to upgrade their free trade pact. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Friday, July 31st here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. South Korea is stepping up its diplomacy on multiple fronts. President Lee Jae Myung is strengthening ties with Latin America during his three-nation tour there, while Seoul unveils a new peace-first approach toward Pyongyang. We'll take a closer look at what these developments mean for regional security and South Korea's foreign policy. For this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to be here, as always.
I also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Park, as always, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Steven, we start here in the studio. Let's begin then with the summit between the leaders of South Korea and Chile. What did they discuss?
The headline that came out of the summit was that they agreed to strengthen cooperation on lithium and copper supply chains. So Chile is has large reserves of these mineral items, and South Korea is always in the market to, particularly, in the past few years, we've really seen the importance of diversifying supply chains and, not wherever possible, not relying exclusively on one destination for a particular mineral that's really integral to the production of any of South Korea's main export items. So this is the kind of diplomacy that I think forms sort of the backbone of South Korean foreign policy, which is, every South Korean president does this kind of thing, whatever their ideological differences. Whether you have a conservative president in power or a progressive, they tend to go around the world and present South Korea as a partner, a state that is interested in buying whatever mineral elements or whatever other kind of products that country has, and is looking to develop its own presence in that country as an exporter and as a country that has a lot of companies that do business overseas, and looking to facilitate those companies' operations in those places. So, yeah, there's a pretty obvious kind of overlap in interest between South Korea and a country like Chile, just because, as I said, South Korea imports a lot of raw materials that Chile is quite abundant in, and is always looking to identify countries that have growing middle classes like those in Latin America, that they can develop its own markets for its exports, to sell appliances or LCD screens or mobile phones or whatever it happens to be. So pretty cordial proceedings over there today, I think.
Right, indeed. Professor Park, generally speaking, what were some of your takeaways from this particular summit?
Well, I'd like to point to three takeaways. First, this was a summit about the economic security and specifically about the critical minerals, as just Steven mentioned. President Jose Antonio Cast himself framed copper and lithium as the indispensable to Korea's electric vehicles and semiconductor chips, and even quoted the Korean proverb, "Two hands are better than one," to describe minerals cooperation as a shared task of stabilizing global supply chains. For Korea, which imports virtually all of these inputs, Chile, the world's leading copper and lithium producers, is about as close to an ideal partner as you can find, and the two industry ministers signed a minerals partnership MOU on the spot. Second, the summit modernized and institutionalized institutional foundation of the relationship. Remember, Chile was Korea's very first FTA partner back in the year 2004, and the two leaders agreed to reactivate the Korea-Chile FTA Joint Committee for the first time in 10 years to discuss upgrading the agreement. President Lee has been explicit that the FTA must evolve to reflect digital trade, AI, clean technologies, and resilient supply chains. So this is really about converting a 20-year-old goods trade agreement into a 21st century economic security framework. They also discussed cooperation through TPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Pacific Alliance, and DEPA, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which suggests Seoul sees Chile as a gateway into the broader Pacific trade architecture. Third, the relationship is broadening well beyond the trade. Cooperation is expanding into infrastructure, defense industry, and policing, alongside science cooperation and Antarctic research and astronomy in the Atacama Desert. And symbolically, President Cast even invite President Lee to jointly visit Antarctica, noting that Korea's research station operates right next to Chile's. The Chakao Bridge project, being built by Korean companies as a hallmark, a landmark of bilateral cooperation, was singled out by both leaders. And I'd add one diplomatic footnote that matters for us here on the Korean Peninsula. President Lee asked for Chile's continued support on resolving the North Korean nuclear issues and establishing peace. The President Cast committed to working together for peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Given that this was the first visit by Korean President to Chile in 11 years and the first summit with a brand new Chilean administration, lacking in the baseline of political support, only is a very meaningful achievement in itself.
Right, indeed. Keeping in mind what Professor Park has just said, Stephen, what has been the foreign media's assessment of President Lee Jae Myung's diplomatic initiatives in that part of the world thus far?
Well, I personally would have loved to have seen more coverage of President Lee's meeting with Lula, the Brazilian leader, because those are two leaders who have kind of similar backgrounds. Both come from, have kind of labor experiences and rose to lead their country with a kind of underdog story and facing really concerted opposition from the other side of the political spectrum. I mean, if I was fortunate enough to be traveling with Lee on this trip as a reporter, that's a story that I would have loved to have tackled. But this tends to not be, speaking as somebody who works in foreign media, South Korean relations with Latin America are kind of a hard sell to an international audience just because there's no real tension, there's no real cross purposes. When a Korean leader goes to the United States or goes to China or goes to Japan, there's a fairly, a much broader kind of context to parse. But when it comes to Korea and Latin America, I think there's just like a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of, we hear a lot about how Korean culture, K-pop, K-dramas are extremely popular in Latin America. I think Koreans kind of admire the, kind of historical and swaggery and kind of cool aspects of Latin America. The two sides seem to get along pretty well. So now when you see a South Korean leader going there, it's just sort of a very logical, very sorts of reasonable things that are coming out. There's no clashing, there's no real fireworks. So it's not something that we're going to see a ton of foreign media coverage of, and the foreign media coverage that we will see is just a kind of a straightforward cataloging of economic and political deals that Professor Park just laid out.
Right. Professor Park, I've been asking this next question to quite a number of pundits this week. How does the Korean leader's outreach to Latin America fit into his broader foreign policy strategy, do you think?
Well, I'd like to frame it with a word that the administration itself uses: pragmatic diplomacy, national interest first, ideology light, and heavily economic. Three strategic logics are very feasible in this tour. The first is supply chain diversification as insurance. Look at the itinerary. This is President Lee's longest trip since taking office, an 11-day two-track journey that began in Silicon Valley with the AI cooperation and then moved to South America for critical minerals and supply chains. Brazil offers rare earth and agricultural goods, Chile's copper and lithium, Argentina shale gas, lithium, and soybeans. In an era of U.S.-China strategic competition, tariff shocks, and weaponized interdependence, Korea is essentially buying insurance, securing stable raw materials, and diversifying markets as supply chains are being restructured. The second logic is what I'd call the Global South diplomacy. The president's presidential office has framed this tour explicitly around expanding trade and investment, diversifying critical mineral supply chains, and strengthening Global South diplomacy. Korea is positioning itself as a partner that offers technology, infrastructure, and defense industry without geopolitical baggage of the great powers. The Brazil next showed the ceiling of this ambition. Seoul and Brasilia agreed to expand the cooperation into defense defense, aerospace, critical minerals, and semiconductors, to establish a joint defense industry committee and to pursue a military information sharing agreement. And crucially, they opened the way to reviving the long-stalled Korea-Mercosur trade talks with the working group aiming for a formal restart in December. That would be a genuine strategic prize, preferential access to South America's largest market bloc. Third, this diversification is complemented to not a substitute for the U.S. alliance. Notice that tour began in San Francisco with American big tech, and even the Argentina leg has the alliance dimension. President Milei's close personal relationship with President Trump can indirectly reinforce trust within the Korea-U.S. alliance. So the architecture is keep the alliance as anchor, restore ties with China. President Yi declared 2026 the first year of full-scale restoration of Korea-China relations after meeting Xi Jinping in Beijing, and build out a wide portfolio of middle power partnership. Latin America is where the portfolio strategy is most visible because it combines resources, markets, defense experts, and diplomatic support for Korea's peace agenda in one package.
All right, and speaking about Korea's peace agenda, just last week, Stephen, Unification Minister Chung Dong-yong said that Seoul is now opting for a peace-first North Korea policy. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so specifically what he said was the ultimate goal of denuclearization has not been abandoned, but denuclearization first has. And Professor Park would know a lot more about this than me, but I'm a little bit confused by this because it seems to me that this has basically been the position of the South Korean progressive side for a very long time. They have always kind of said that the way to approach North Korea was to have smaller collaborative projects, to build trust, to take steps that establish a certain level of cooperation. And there's a lot of examples over the years. It's sports exchanges at the Olympics, or the Kaesong Industrial Complex, or cross-border tourism. They've always kind of operated that the way to approach North Korea is to not negotiate with the very challenging goal of denuclearization at the forefront of your approach, but to take smaller, more incremental steps that could eventually lead to unification, which is their, the South Korean left side's ultimate goal. So I was a little bit surprised by this because it seemed like he was basically just kind of articulating something that I have been hearing the left wing say for a very long time. I mean, there is a certain logic to it because North Korea has demonstrated that it is quite intent on keeping its nuclear weapons, but I suspect that if he is going to try to carry this out in some sort of practical way, he is going to, the South Korean Ministry of Communication and the government as a whole are going to run into the same kind of roadblock that has been presenting itself for years now, basically ever since Kim Jong-un's failed summit with President Trump in Hanoi, that North Korea is just has shown no interest in these kinds of collaboration projects. They, whether it be the excavation of Korean War veterans from the DMZ, or having kind of working level talks, so the sorts of things that used to be routine. North Korea has not responded to any of those overtures for a long time, and everything that we know about North Koreans' foreign policy nowadays is that they are all in on expanding their ties with Russia and China, and they have shown no interest in engaging with South Korea or the U.S. So. The minister's comments, like I said, there is a certain logic to it, but I wonder how much progress he will really be able to make.
All right, that being said then, Professor Park, do tell us, the Unification Ministry's new Peace First North Korea policy, is it simply reaffirming the Liberal Party's stance with regard to dealing with North Korea, or is it something new? And also, what are your thoughts with regard to the prospects of this policy in engaging North Korea?
Yeah, my answer is it creates the condition for an opening, but not yet the opening itself, because the door has to be unlocked from both sides. Let me first give the policy's due. Minister Chung's shift is the recognition of reality. Seoul has abandoned the denuclearization first, while retaining denuclearization as the ultimate goal, and is developing a strategy that would initially seek to freeze North Korea's nuclear program on the logic that continuous delay only allow Pyongyang to expand its arsenal. The previous approach, as the minister put it, simply failed to bring North Korea back to the table. Every year of stalemate is a year of fissile material accumulation, so front-loading peace and tension reduction while pursuing a freeze is analytically the more realistic sequencing. And there has been small but real signals of reciprocity this year when President Lee expressed regret over a drone incursion incident. Kim Jong-un thought Kim Yo-jong's statement, praised it as the attitude of the candid and bold person, and so assessed that the two leaders intended to hold unnecessary tension-raising act has been confirmed. That tells us that Pyongyang is watching and that tension management, the peace half of the peace first, is actually functioning. However, here's the hard part, the denuclearization some days have. Just this week, on July 27, Kim Yo-jong denounced the ARF chairman's statements calling for denuclearization as pathetic, declared that clinging to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a failure of strategic thinking and a foolish delusion, and insisted that North Korea's nuclear status is permanently fixed by constitution, vowing its nuclear capability will be constantly update without a moment pause. So my assessment is this: peace first has successfully lowered the temperature and reestablished a rudimentary signaling channel between the two leadership. This is not nothing after years of hostility, but a genuine diplomatic opening will likely require U.S.-North Korea variable. Because Kim Jong-un's real negotiation counterpart for his nuclear program is Washington, not Seoul. What Seoul is doing sensibly is keeping the peninsula quiet and positioning itself as an indispensable facilitator for the moment that window opens.
Right, and speaking about Kim Jong-un, according to the Wall Street Journal, Stephen, he is upgrading his spy network. Could you tell us a bit about this and its broader implications?
This is another thing that I found kind of confusing, and I'll explain why. This is the Wall Street Journal story is built on a state media missive where Kim called for radical enhancements to North Korea's military reconnaissance and intelligence-seeking abilities. And I don't find it at all strange that he would want to increase those things, because North Korea relies on, covert and under-the-radar information for a lot of different things, for its military activities and also for a lot of the ways that it makes money, such as hacking and cyber scams and all the rest. But what I didn't quite understand was why the state media ran this in a very open and public forum. It strikes me as a little bit counterintuitive for a leader to stand at a podium and say publicly, we are going to expand our spying and we are going to expand our covert activities. It seems like something that you would want to keep quiet. If you want to expand those activities, you can have kind of, backroom private conversations with the relevant officials. I'm not exactly, as with a lot of things with North Korea, you have to, there's a certain reading of the tea leaves. You read what they say and then you try to parse what really they might be trying to accomplish with this. And I think maybe only time will tell there. The other thing that I didn't quite get is, if what they're referring to is conventional espionage, that's going to be harder than ever for North Korea to do nowadays, because they've closed a lot of their embassies. They've really retrenched their global presence, and they've really reduced their interchange with the outside world. There are fewer people coming in. There are fewer North Koreans going out. There are fewer overseas posts where North Korean officials can make inroads in the local community and hear what business people are saying and hear about new opportunities that the country could potentially take advantage of. As I said earlier, everything we've seen from North Korea for a quite long time shows that it's quite happy with the productive nature of its ties with Beijing and Moscow, and it's really focused on those things. So perhaps the implication here is that it's looking to, now that it's established these military and technological forms of cooperation with those two countries, and now wants to deepen those into the areas of intelligence gathering, but we'll have to see where they go from here.
All right. In the meantime then, Professor Park, should the international community view this upgrade in spy network as a bigger long-term threat than the regime's missile tests, do you think?
In the long run, yes, I would take this intelligence upgrade more seriously, and let me explain why. First, look at what's actually happening. At the first enlarged meeting of the party's 9th Central Military Commission, Kim Jong-un called for expanding the functions and missions of the General Reconnaissance and Intelligence Bureau in a radical way. And this bureau is not new bureaucratic wallpaper. It's reorganization of the old Reconnaissance General Bureau into a unified intelligence agency integrating satellite, cyber, signals, and human intelligence, reportedly with authority to report directly to Kim himself. His predecessors was accused of directing the 2010 sinking of Cheonan corvette ships, infiltration operation, and major cyber attacks. So this is the institutional consolidation of North Korea's entire covert toolkit. Second, the strategic context makes it more dangerous than before. Analysts believe Pyongyang intended to apply the military intelligence warfare experience it gains in the Russian-Ukraine war. That experience would go into reconnaissance against South Korea, cyber warfare, and intelligence collection. The move also aims to make up for weak collection capacity by building intelligence sharing ties with Russia and China, with the satellite technology flowing from the Moscow in return for North Korea's war supports. And remember, this comes after Pyongyang's dismantlement of its inter-Korean dialogue institutions on the two hostile state line, meaning South Korea is now treated primarily as an intelligence and military target. Third, and this is the key analytic position point, missiles and espionage sit on different risk curves. Missile tests are visible, countable, and deterrable. Each launch trigger detection, attribution, and response. Intelligence and cyber operation are opposite, invisible, deniable, continuous, and already profitable. North Korea was reportedly behind roughly 2/3 of global crypto theft in the first half of this year alone. That's the sanctions-proof revenue from stream that directly funds for missile program. That said, I resist framing this as either or. The two threats are converging: better satellites, better cyber reconnaissance, and better human network make North Korea missile more accurate, more survivable, and more usable. So the right answer for the international community is treat the expansion of a general reconnaissance and the intelligence bureau as a nervous system of missile threats.
Dual threats then. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Professor Park, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you for having me.
Stephen here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, for now then, we'll continue to follow all related developments closely, from Seoul's evolving diplomatic strategy overseas to the shifting security dynamics here on the Korean Peninsula. Have a great weekend.